I think it's very easy to get stereotypical and say crypto is a young person's technology. It's not true. So and anyone can learn how to use crypto.
Welcome to The Feedback Loop, a Sino Global Capital podcast where we keep you in the loop about the most pressing issues in Web3 today. I'm your host, Mona Hamdi, a Harvard teaching fellow with 20 years of experience in nonprofit and sustainable development. I started using emerging technologies 15 years ago, working with remote peoples to create new economies based on the reversal of climate change. And today, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Sino, where I hope to bring beneficial technologies to the most forgotten corners of this planet. On today's episode, I'm joined by my good friend and crypto policy advocate and expert, Sheila Warren. Sheila is the CEO of the Crypto Council for Innovation, the CCI, a global alliance that includes a number of prominent crypto industry pioneers, including Coinbase, Fidelity Digital Assets, Block, Gemini, and Paradigm. Before joining CCI, Sheila served as the Deputy Global Head of the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution at the World Economic Forum. I'm so excited to have Sheila on the feedback loop. She's a really good friend of mine. I'm very excited to talk to her about all things related to crypto, policy, the fund, motherhood, being a woman in the space, and all kinds of stuff. So let's jump right into it. Hey, Sheila.
Hey, Mona. It's so great to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. I want to get right into it and start kind of where you and I met in that part of your career where you were with the Digital Currency Consortium and the World Economic Forum with the 4IR. You described the Currency Consortium as a global alliance composed of industry leadership looking to create evidence-based advocacy, which is something that I think our industry needs. Tell me about what that means. What is evidence-based advocacy in crypto today?
It's such a great question. And I'll just start by saying when I founded the blockchain digital assets team at the forum didn't have a really clear picture about what we were going to do in that space. And so it was up to me to develop a strategy. And what I realized was that crypto, and this is not a massive realization that thing had to hit me over the head. It's pretty obvious. Crypto wasn't doing a great job of communicating, to say the least, right? You had true diehard believers who were largely in online spaces, who were talking to each other in echo chambers, and who were, frankly, a little bit, very kind when you got to know them. But when it came to kind of in groups and out groups, we're very much an in group, and you were either a believer in crypto or you were an enemy, basically, right? I felt like part of my job had been, and I for the last 5 years, to normalize crypto and to say, mainstreaming it is the responsibility of, wallet builders, all of these folks who it has to be usable, but normalizing it and saying, if you use crypto, if you're interested in crypto, if you're crypto curious, you're not crazy, you're not a criminal, you're not destroying the earth. None of these things are true. And to me, the way to do that was to actually bring evidence to the table and to say, what do we know? What do we not know? And how do we prove what we know? And how do we get the evidence to demonstrate what we don't know? Why don't we know the things we don't know? That's really interesting, right? Is it because no one cares? Is it because it's not important? Is it because we're just not evolved enough yet as an ecosystem? So all of that is what I did at the forum and I do today at the Crypto Council.
In Washington, D.C., where we spend a lot of our time, there's advocacy and lobbying, and they seem to be really different, right? How do you differentiate between the two? And then how does one gain favor in both of those areas?
I think it's a great question. So I think in the United States, there is a traditional kind of path for lobbyists and lobbying. And we do employ lobbyists at the Crypto Council. We do have most crypto companies at this point in prominence do have lobbyists engaged in some fashion. And their responsibility is to really open doors to meetings with various people, policymakers, others, to kind of get you in the door, right? But then when you're in that door, what do you say? And to me, I say what I've always said, which is, this is why crypto is interesting to someone like me, who I think is a different profile than a lot of the sort of common stereotypes around people who engage with crypto. It's why I think it's so important for the future of whatever country I'm in, but let's say for the sake of argument, for Washington, for the United States of America. And here are the things about it that I think offer an opportunity. And then kicker, here is the proof of that, right? Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. Here's how the trajectory of things is shaping up. And if you, policymaker X, care about financial inclusion, or if you care about the environment, or if you care about privacy and civil liberties, whatever it is you care about, if you care about jobs and economic growth, here is why crypto is an opportunity for engagement that is really unparalleled in our generation.
Tell me a little bit about what that feels like when you're with policymakers. How does that come across, and where's that going globally?
Yeah, I think that the economic part of this, I think, is relatively obvious, right? So the idea that there's a lot of money in this industry, and that's what drew some people to it, quite a few people to it. It's what continues to draw some people to it. I'm a very different kind of person. Like, I find the price of a particular crypto asset to be like the least interesting thing you could ask me. And I'm here because I know you'll never ask me that, because it's just to some extent irrelevant. Now, not in the micro sense, it's very relevant to whoever owns that asset, but in the macro sense of what we're trying to build. And I'm a person that spent a lot of time, a decade to be precise, even more than that, actually 15 years, thinking a lot about the problems of what we call Web2, platforms, general technology as a general matter, and how it was leaving certain people behind and serving as a catalyst so that some people who are what I call pre-wealthy got even wealthier. And a lot of people were exploited for those people to become quite wealthy or even wealthier, or just left behind altogether. And what I think we have a chance to remedy in Web3 and in crypto is to look at what are some of the mistakes that we made. Now, in some cases, that was deliberate. In some cases, it was entirely accidental, right? I'm not saying there was like Machiavellian, orchestration going on here. Nevertheless, we created a digital divide that's really real. And that's stemmed and contributed to, or not stemmed, it's actually spurred rather and contributed to the financial divide, the economic divide that has gotten worse and worse. This pandemic, let me tell you, did not help. So how do we try to correct some of that, or at the very least, not make it worse and not create yet another mechanism that's going to stratify our society globally? And I mean that at three levels. So one is some countries will benefit and others will fall behind. So at a country level, at a community level, within a country, some communities are going to benefit while others do not. And then at an individual and family level, some people within a family are empowered, right? Or individuals are empowered by their society they live in to take certain kinds of risks, engage in certain kinds of activity, and others are not. How do we reimagine those relationships and those dynamics using this technology and what it can afford us?
It's a really interesting point, Sheila, because, through COVID and beyond to the present day, I think that we do see, the promise of crypto as being sort of the great equalizer and the great liberator, actually creating that income gap or that wealth gap. And we see it specifically targeting the same sort of vulnerable demographics in the DeFi space that we would in traditional economic systems. And here I'm talking about marginalized communities, and I'm talking about women. So, how do you feel that we can come together then? What are effective measures that we can take, or that a government or a rising market can take to ensure that we don't at least widen the gap, and that maybe we hold true to that sort of optimistic promise?
Well, I call those communities historically excluded communities, because I think that we should place the onus where it lands, right, where it belongs, which is to say there has been systematic exclusion by the banking system, by technology of certain communities who are just not considered in the build and design of those systems. Now, in some cases, that's a result of actual bias, redlining the United States, just deliberately denying loans or mortgages or shoving people to certain kinds of property ownership or not others or whatever. There's so many different ways this has happened. In some cases, it's things like the Bank Secrecy Act. It's some things like correspondent banks that have pulled out of certain countries, right? They're not operating in those countries. So getting money to Nicaragua is much more expensive than getting it to the UK for no really good reason, frankly, right? It's around our kind of fears around terrorist funding and all this kind of stuff, which are real fears. Nevertheless, they have been, overbroad in their application. So we already have a system that has been highly problematic. And I think it's not surprising that we've seen crypto uptake by a lot of countries, by a lot of communities, by a lot of individuals who have been historically excluded from these systems. What I'm worried about, let's take an example. Okay. So in the United States, there's this system, there's this rule around what's called an accredited investor. Okay. So if you basically make a certain amount of money or have a certain amount of money, you're what I call pre-wealthy, you are allowed to make certain kinds of investments. You're allowed to, broadening that, take on certain kinds of risk. If you are poor, you're just not allowed to. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter how educated you are. It doesn't matter how well you know the system. None of those things matter. It is strictly a wealth criterion, right? Either you have enough money to take a risk or you do not. Who has decided that? The government. Why? Because they think they're protecting unaccredited investors, protecting poor people, right? I find that to be deeply offensive on multiple levels, right?
For sure.
Some of that was corrected through the Jobs Act, right? Where in the Jobs Act, we said, okay, if there's a small business and your brother's starting a restaurant, you should be able to invest in that restaurant, right? You should be able to kind of like, that person. Why should it always be the case that you can't engage in something? So there's this small business exception to spur small business economic growth. But generally speaking, if you are, and I'm not talking like a poor, I'm talking like a middle-class kind of ordinary person, right. You are not allowed to engage in certain kinds of tactics that make people very, very wealthy in this country. I'm really concerned, and I see some of this starting to creep in. It's one thing I've been working on very hard in Congress. Some of this concept that, poor people are just too poor, they're just not able to take on crypto risk, to assess it correctly, to understand what it means, to place it within their own, portfolio, whatever it looks like. They just shouldn't be allowed to do it. And the easiest way to protect them is just to categorically disallow it. So rules like that might have good intention. The intention is consumer protection, but the flip side is you're just not allowed the opportunities that have resulted in making wealthy people really, really wealthy. And it's hugely problematic. So there's things like this where I think we have to flip our lens, think less about paternalistic or patronizing protection and more about empowerment and agency and education with caveats, with warnings, with all the things that I think are important, because there are scammers in this space. Let's just be honest about that. It's just a fact. How do we differentiate, right? And it's not been the focus thus far of regulation and policy.
I have the same sort of nagging worries, both in the traditional finance and in the DeFi spaces, pretty much everywhere around the world, is that as we move toward you might say that like Reg CF in the United States was sort of this harbinger of a feeling of a panacea or something meant to appease or to bridge something. Anything that has fractional ownership was being marketed or being seen as this way to building wealth, when the truth was that really wasn't the same sort of, investing in these wealth-making opportunities that these pre-wealthy communities would have. And it might actually end up becoming detrimental, right? So we saw KYC change because of those kinds of regulations. And in as much as they open the space, I wonder, to your point, how much they actually might have been counterproductive.
That's the thing. And to my knowledge, no one has done that deep analysis. It's very hard, to be fair, to do that kind of, of causation analysis. But certainly correlation exists. Like we kind of just know that intuitively, and the facts sort of prove that. So not sort of, they do prove that. And so I think it's just important to understand that we might have, again, the best of intentions going forward. Protecting people from bad actors is always a good thing, in my opinion, right? And there are bad actors.
Sure. Yes.
But it's less about categorically telling people, adults aren't children, right? And so it's one thing for me to tell my 9-year-old, no, you can't put your money in that machine. It's going to steal your money, because I know it's going to steal your money because we're at a fair and that's what it does, right? Or if you play that game, understand you're not winning that prize, right? Like I'm going to tell you that. It's a very different thing for me to tell, a mother of 2 who works 2 jobs, I'm just making up these hypotheticals, but like the reality is when you don't have a lot of money, you're very careful about your money. And so I think a lot of people who are in these positions of authority aren't really thinking with the mindset of someone who's been in that situation. And I think only about myself. I have a relatively privileged life, but I still, at the age of 19, 20, I could barely hold on to a bank account. Barely. The fees I had to pay. I was constantly worried about overdraft fees. The fee I had to pay because my bank account was so small, right? I had to pay for the privilege of putting my money in a bank.
And of withdrawing your money, right? Like you'd have to pay for every single time those exorbitant fees.
Exactly. And now I'm a not 19-year-old. I'm significantly older than 19 years old. Not much. 20 at the ripe old age of 25. It's just very, very different. Right. And I have banks like courting me almost, right? Saying like, come put your account here and what, it's just it's such a different world. And so I just think people need to understand that even our basic banking system is failing a lot of people. And I'm not even talking about things. I'm not talking about the investment opportunity, any of that. I'm talking about just the ability to put your money somewhere, quote unquote, safe, where it is held for you, and where it's not under your pillow. It's not somewhere like that. Even those kinds of services don't exist meaningfully for a lot of people without a ton of fees. And that's just something that I think is so forgotten by a lot of folks, including a lot of people in our industry. So it's just kind of like a lot of even our language and lexicon is so predicated on the idea that we built a thing. And I think we should acknowledge our banking system. It works really well or well enough for most people. That is true. Right? So I'm not here to throw it under the bus, but it doesn't work for a lot of people. And there are reasons for that, again, some of which are intentional, some of which are just the system as it's arisen around, these kinds of services. Nevertheless, we need to do better. We need to do better fast. And I don't see an alternative that is better than crypto and the opportunity it entails, provided that, and this is a gigantic caveat, which is why I took the role that I took as CEO of the Crypto Council, is to say the policy has to support that. And if our policy, again, becomes so prescribed that only rich people can use this stuff, then what is the point of any of it?
And it's interesting that you answer that question with the Crypto Council, but it seems that your role at the DeFi Education Fund is sort of meant to provide that education and awareness to answer that. So tell me more about the DeFi Education Fund.
Sure.
I love this.
Yeah. So I'm on the steering committee of something called the DeFi Education Fund. And the CEO there is a phenomenal guy named Miller Whitehouse Levine, who I think is like an undersung hero of DeFi. So I'm just going to shout him out right here. And he has done, I think, more for educating folks in DeFi, by which I mean policymakers, than probably any other single human being in the United States, I'd say for sure. And so DeFi Education Fund is a grant-making institution. We make a lot of grants around creating this kind of evidence, right? So saying, let's examine where there are problems in existing systems. Let's look at support around different kinds of models. Let's look at experiments that are happening in different parts of the world. All these kinds of things are part of what DEF does. But DEF is also looking at how do we protect the innovation space? How do we create a wide aperture for DeFi? And particularly at this time of explosive growth in the DeFi ecosystem, this is not a time for regulation to come in and like ban this or put it into one tiny, narrow stream of activity. It's a time for us to start knowing some experiments will fail. That is the nature of innovation. Some experiments will fail and there will be costs to those failures. How do we create a structured environment in which those experiments can actually happen and not preclude their existence because of misguided, although possibly well-intentioned policy?
What is a DEF footprint in rising markets like Africa and MENA?
It's
and South Asia look like?
It's a great question. I want to talk about that, and I want to also tell you about something called Cradle that I'm not sure is on your radar, that I want to make sure is on your radar, which I co-founded. So DEF was actually funded by a giant grant from the Uniswap community that came over. And so that is the source of funding. There are additional sources that we're looking at over time to kind of bolster the amounts that were put in there by that community. I think it's been a year or so since, maybe a year and a half, since the thing was funded and launched. And so then we hired Miller to basically run it as the executive director. And since then, he's engaged in Europe primarily. It's been like a build around Washington engagement specifically, but then European engagement as well. And then Cradle, which I think you'll be very interested in, is the Crypto Research and Design Lab that I co-founded with Trisha Wong. And we added another co-founder named Lauren Serrata. And Trisha's a tech ethnographer. And I became fascinated by this concept of tech ethnography when I was at the forum. And so I basically got a bunch of funding at the forum to found this thing, which looks at what do communities actually need and benefit from? So their first phase of work was in Texas. It was meant to be abroad, but then COVID with the travel and quarantines, we were like, let's just keep it in the United States for now. First phase of work was in Texas, and now they've shifted to New York and New Jersey. And they're going into communities supported by the mayor's offices, supported by local Congress people, supported by schools and libraries and others. They're going in and saying, what are the problems here around financial services, around tech, other things around data? What are they? Can crypto be helpful? Is it being helpful? And if not, why not? If so, why? And if not, why not? And in some cases, it may be that the problems people are actually facing are not solvable by any technical solution. They're about other kinds of things that accompany some of these problems of historically excluded populations we're talking about, right? Or the shorthand unbanked term that we decided, but we've agreed that we hate.
We hate this term.
Right? There are a lot of other things that go into that problem or that issue space.
So a few things. Cradle is addressing the sort of structural barriers that people have to adoption. And it's not surprising to me that it sounds like it was founded by women. Yes. So tell me.
That is true.
I am, you're part of my OG crypto stack. My Ladies of Crypto network was really my start and my foundation. And I'm not surprised that this was founded by women in crypto. So, this social anthropological approach to problem solving, this is fascinating. Tell me a little bit about that, about women in crypto making cool stuff to actually get to root causes of problems.
I mean, look, I think such an interesting question, right? So there are women all over crypto, first of all, on this, like, it drives me crazy. People are like, where are all the women in crypto? And I'm like, just because you're spotlighting like the tech bro does not mean that the women are not here, because we are everywhere. I mean, there are more women in crypto than there are women in traditional tech, and more women in, let me tell you, big law. When I was in big law, there were not that many women, there are more. And of course that was 20 years ago. So we're talking about times have shifted, but nevertheless, I mean, it's not like women are abundant in any of these fields, in finance and law and technology. In crypto, we're doing better. We could do a lot more, obviously, but we're doing better. And so it drives me crazy. People are like, where are all the women? Where are all the women? It's like, you're just not bothering to like open your eyes and look, we're everywhere. So I do think that I'll speak for myself. I certainly don't want to speak for all women. And I can speak a bit for Trisha on this. When we came together and we were talking about like, what is missing? Like why is it that it is so hard to make the case around inclusion? Why is it that at the time, a couple of years ago, we're lacking in really robust use cases beyond remittances, which is a really known, understood, cross-border money in general is a very understood. I think it's kind of like a OG use case. Everyone gets it, right? And small dollar value, of course, is also very understood. But why is there not more of this? And we're like, is it? And for a while, it was very obvious to me. It's because the UX, like, it was just terrible. Like, you could not, no one could figure out how to do this. That was like a regular person, right? I mean, like, I remember the first time I shifted something from like a hard wallet, I was like sweating bullets. Like, it's just terrifying, so no one's doing that, right? So I think with the advent of centralized exchanges, frankly, it became easier for people to understand this. I think people kind of, with NFTs, I think things became more normalized, right? So we had a lot of these opportunities that people kind of could relate to in a more normal human consumer, frankly, kind of way.
Right.
But we were really interested in like community-oriented solutions. And this, I think, comes as much from our civic tech background. Both of us have very strong civic tech backgrounds, as it does from any sort of approach that was more community-oriented, right? Because our view was communities design all the time. Communities design solutions to problems all the time. And this is, I think, more visible in poor communities in the United States. It's visible outside of American libertarian independent, prizing independent society, like in Egypt, in India, right? Like in the Middle East, all over the Middle East, all over Asia, you have community. You have this idea that the whole "it takes a village to raise children" thing does not come from the United States. Let me tell you, it's used in the United States as a warning or admonishment to say other people don't think like this. They don't. They don't have this kind of So we bring some of that sensibility. And Trisha is a Chinese American woman. I'm an Indian American woman. We grew up in families and communities that had a sense of collectivism to them. We're like, how do we bring that to crypto, which is fundamentally all about community?
That's a really interesting point. And then those populations, blended third culture family, immigrants.
Yep.
You hustle, and it takes a village. And if one of you rises, all of you rise a little bit. If one of you falls, you all kind of come together with a network. So it's really interesting and not surprising that you created Cradle.
It's fascinating. Trisha organized what she called a Web3-a-thon at Consensus this year in Texas. And it was so well, it was people all over the world dialing in, giving their talent, giving their time, thinking about how do we solve real, actual, not invented problems, hypothetical problems, actual, real problems. And I want to shout out my dear friend Marnie Webb, who, when I was general counsel at TechSoup, which is the civic, was a lot of my civic tech time was spent there building product, but also being general counsel there. She came up with this model of generators, and she'd go into communities in the Rust Belt and basically say, what are the problems you're trying to solve? What are the issues? What is keeping you and your children from thriving? What your families and communities? And they would figure out, like, can we create an app, create a resource, create something that's going to be helpful? And then how do we create a funding stream to maintain that thing? Because of course, the problem with hackathons, as you well know, or anyone knows, is you build this cool thing and then everyone loses interest. And no one wants to maintain it going forward. No one wants to upgrade it, update it, and then so then
who does it belong to?
Who does it belong to? Yeah. They had a model that I helped with all the legal on the back end of thinking about all of this. How do you create a more sustainable model of that kind of community-oriented development that can work? And this is all rooted back in a book that I threw at her, which is called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I mentioned to you. I mean, you read. It's by Paulo Freire. And so all of this thinking dates back to like the 40s and 50s. It's not new thinking, right? This is like civic tech, community-driven technology. This is stuff that goes way back and no one has to reinvent it.
Tell me a little bit about the OECD.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was part of, I think they called it BPAB, which no one ever used that acronym, but that was kind of the blockchain. I don't even know what it's for.
I'm so
Policy
glad you're
Advisory
teaching
Board.
me like all the ways to say the thing, right? Because when I read them,
yeah, you're like, what? Everyone just called it the OECD Advisory Board. That's what we all called it.
Yeah.
So that I think was really global, and it was intended to kind of think about how might governments think about blockchain and the use of blockchain. It led to INATBA. It led to a number of other kinds of associations and things that are focused a bit on how can governments use this technology. And so separate to that, I was part of this working group in California that the governor's office pulled together, Governor Newsom's office pulled together, called the California Blockchain Working Group, that identified similar to OECD, identified what are cases in California, what are actual opportunities here in the state of California, and what are things that really it's just the technology is not ready yet, et cetera. What's been fascinating is watching output from all these things, work I did at WEF, work with the OECD Advisory Board, work with California. We're all over the place. Digital Currency Governance Consortium. I watch this get picked up. So now when I meet with the governor's office and with DFPI, all these different agencies in California, they are looking to that output and saying what's shifted, what's changed, how do we dog food this, meaning how do we try it out ourselves with government services? All of this, I think it's fascinating. But it was like, when I think back to 5 years ago, we've come so far in that time, so far in that time.
Like, where do you put the flag, right? Where do you start measuring from that kind of stuff?
That's the thing. It's really, really hard. But that's why, to get back to the evidence-based advocacy, this is not a brand new, Bitcoin's 13 years old, right? There are things that we just know at this point in time about the way these things function and what is coming and what it's moving forward into. And there are things that we just don't know, because things like DeFi are really only a couple of years old. How could we possibly be able to create robust, long-standing policy on something like DeFi when it's so new? It's really almost an impossible task. I'm pointing that out and pointing out the differences, I think, is really powerful, because there's a permission there to say we do have to be cautious. We don't want to take people's shirts off their backs in the course of experiments, right? At the same time, there's something here that's really important and powerful. We don't want to cut off that innovation. We don't want to narrow that aperture of potential because we're afraid.
Walk us through a little bit of your experience with the policymakers, for example. What metrics should they be referring to in terms of how to make sense, just the sense making of this? And maybe not necessarily in the United States per se, but in rising markets, we have well-meaning regulators, well-meaning policymakers who are very concerned with, capital controls and AML and KYC and really being open. What should they be looking at?
Yeah. So I think that one thing that's really interesting and that it just is overlooked, bizarrely to me, is number of crypto wallet holders per capita, which you can get that data, right? It's not even that hard to find. And so if you look at somewhere like Lagos, for example, and you realize, first of all, one of the fintech capitals of the world, which is not widely known outside of the continent. It certainly is very much the case. And anyone who's paying any attention understands that. So I'm always aside, it's like a barometer for me. If someone's like, Nigeria has a fintech population, I'm like, okay, now we know where we are, right? Now we know. Well, it shouldn't be surprising that crypto exploded all over that country, biggest market in Africa, for a million reasons, right?
Right.
Contrast Kenya, where you had immediate bans that came in, right? And look at the difference in what happened there. So you can do some compare and contrast, I think, even among, countries that consider themselves somewhat compatible, right? I think ASEAN is another really amazing example of an explosion. It's Central America, ASEAN, and I would say the Sahel are places where we're seeing a bunch of these different explosions in crypto wallet holders, right? At one point, South Korea, this was I think this data was 2018 or so, highest number per capita of crypto wallet holders of any country in the world in South Korea. And the Korean parliament was ready to ban everything, right? And the presidency was really interested in how do we move forward? How do we get this to be more, how do we understand it better? Et cetera. So you had these totally opposing, that's crazy. How could we ever, that's criminal money. We don't want to be accused of money laundering and having all that, all the Interpol and everyone, in our borders. With this could poise and position South Korea to be on the cutting edge and overtake maybe some of the other countries that have been, dominant in the economic sphere. So that's one metric, I think. The other, I think, is how digital is your economy already? And that's something that everyone should really have a good sense of if you're a policymaker, right? Ironically, the United States is not a super digital economy compared to many countries in the world, right? all of Asia, I would actually argue, right, is far more digital in their economic engagement than the United States, right? So if you look around and you kind of see like, what's the readiness, then you understand like we're already engaging on this. The psychological leap to using, a digital wallet of some kind to use fiat versus crypto is basically nil. It doesn't really exist because you're already engaged in that kind of operation already, right?
Right.
That's really fascinating. So there's things like that I think are important. Then I think the question becomes, what is the economic opportunity within your borders? So our member Electric Capital did this really fantastic analysis on GitHub to say where code commits coming from. Like where are developers actually in the world? And the point of that was to prove to Washington the White House is not it's not the United States.
It's not coming from Chicago.
Really not coming from right. You may think this is an opportunity for Milwaukee, but let me tell you, it's really an opportunity for Romania, whatever it is, right?
Right.
So that's fascinating. Pandemic accelerated some of that as well, but you can just kind of see the people who are engineering this, who are actually coding it, disproportionately outside the United States. But if you're a policymaker elsewhere, you can say, how can I get those numbers up? Is it education in public universities? Is it sponsorship of a scholarship? Is it like all kinds of things that can happen to get that talent in your country? So I did a project at the Forum with Colombia. And part of what I insisted on with the grant we got from Inter-American Development Bank was we want to go into Nacional Universidad de Colombia in Bogota, and we want to create a division essentially there. There's a professor who's fantastic. We want to create a whole module and product and leave that behind and leave developers in that country, which is already very at the cutting edge of a lot of thinking about blockchain technology. But like that is important and critical part of this. And a lot of people, right, they fly in folks and it's a huge issue. And then there's like this giant vacuum. We were like, we need to be creating an infrastructure around this technology so that knowledge of it stays in country.
A few anecdotes that ring true to me from the Arab world. So on one end, we have Abu Dhabi that incubated a neobank sort of within its, innovation infrastructure. When you open an account at the neobank, they have an NFT artist, right? An NFT and a smart contract lawyer who's sort of overseeing this stuff, which I thought was remarkable for challenging what we consider these sort of digital banks or neobanks. And then on the North Africa side, the gateway to digitization is really through blockchain projects. We met with a regulator recently who said that he looks for the longest queue. Wherever you find a queue of a certain length is probably a good idea for a national would that qualify for a blockchain project at the national scale to put the pressure off of that resource? Using blockchain as the gateway to broad scale digital infrastructure creation is really an interesting question because it's almost inverse.
Yeah, that's I think part of where I think California was so prescient in doing this in like 2019, I think it was, and pulling this working group together to say how can we use it here so that we're educated. Because it's not just education of the population, it's education of the government as well, right? Like we're seeing such a drain out. The minute someone gets to be an expert in government anywhere in the world, they're hired by a blockchain company or crypto company.
That's exactly
and
right.
that talent is then in-house, which is great, except that it's not always great, right? Because you're like, we need these people also in positions of policy because that is, what's going to make or break crypto, I'll just say this till the cows come home, is policy. Like that's it. The biggest threat to crypto over the next 2 years is policy and regulation, bar none. It's not anything else. That's it. Because that is going to define, again, this aperture of innovation. What are you allowed to experiment with and innovate on without fear of, as dramatic as jail time, right? That's it. That's ball game. If some of these things are forbidden in enough countries of the world or in major economies, it's game over. Like this is it. So again, why I took this role, to get back to your initial question about what should people be looking at, what's your demographic population? Like how young are you in population net growth? I think it's very easy to get stereotypical and say crypto is a young person's technology. It's not true. So and anyone can learn how to use crypto. I don't know a single kid of any of my friends' kids who are not digital natives, and totally not just digital natives of like people in their 20s, digital natives of like they were born with the thing attached to the thing. And we try to control all of that, but their influences are social media stars. It's just the things that they think about as being powerful are very, very different from things we talked about. So it was my, at the time, 7-year-old, and she was playing an online game with her friend, right? And they were like, and it was like a math game because of course, like, can't take the India out of the Indian mom, right? So they're playing some math game. She's bopping around her online world, her purple hair and her like dragon buddy following her and like waving her wand around. And her friend is over there with like the high pink boots and whatever, right? But they're FaceTiming in parallel. So they're talking to each other in the corner of the screen and they're real faces, but their avatars are doing things and engaging online. And to them, like, it's so seamless. And they would refer, what I thought was fascinating is they were referring to their characters as being something they could turn on and off as they so chose. And I think that is fascinating. I think NFTs are the embodiment of this, right? Like you have an NFT as your avatar. That's an aspect of your personality or identity that you're taking very seriously, that you're invested in some cases to the tune of like a lot of money, that matters to you. But that isn't necessarily the entirety of your being. And as we kind of mediate our online and offline realities, like, I mean, you and I, like I've been, working with tech since like 1996, right? Or 1994, even honestly. I played Oregon Trail, which is a very different kind of, but I had a website in 1994, right? So very early on, I had this concept of online identity and offline identity and what you put out into the world and what you were kind of broadcasting that has evolved because I've been engaging in this stuff for 30 years. But people who are newer to that, who have more analog realities, like it's interesting watching them dive in and first get that glimpse of online interaction and what it means, right? But for our kids, they all have it. They all have it. I don't care how traditional you are and how much you monitor screens or whatever. They get it. They understand intuitively, and they just have this concept because of how they interact in the world and what they talk about.
This is something that you and I are both really passionate about. For me, I call it the digital right to not exist. And I know you've spent many years talking about privacy and that digitally extended version of yourself. Where do you see us, especially in recent days? I think that the United States coming to grips with the difference between being questioned by the SEC and being questioned by these rules of OFAC with which in other parts of the world, anywhere you're transacting with the United States or its currency, you're quite familiar with them. And the sort of global pause over identity, over privacy, the idea that someone can airdrop something to me now and I have no recourse is really being challenged, right? How far I'm allowed to be transparent and how far I should be transparent. Where do you see that going?
This is the perennial question. And I think that we're going to have some really tough debates as a community, as a crypto community, around what are our boundaries around behavior, right? Because I think, and I'm going to speak personally for myself now, not for any of the organizations I'm affiliated with, which I've been doing this whole time. I should probably have caveated that, but definitely right now, I think, I am a bit of a privacy nut. I think people want privacy for all kinds of reasons. And when I say that, it's not like I funnily enough, I am far more, vehement about protecting privacy. I don't even myself, care about that much. Like I'm like, whatever about my own privacy in many ways. But when it comes to people who would choose to have more privacy in certain, particularly online environments, I am like vehement about that. I think it's extremely important. I'm among the people that was horrified by the Patriot Act and kind of like the overreach and all of those kinds of things. It was just absolutely appalling kinds of things that we saw happen. So that being said, we do have a history of the erosion of privacy and civil liberties in all countries in the world, including the United States, over time, really starting in about 2000 and then moving forward until now. It's not gotten better. It's only gotten worse. It really isn't anyone's business. That I bought a cup of coffee at 10 a.m. on a Monday from a store. That's not anyone's business, and it really shouldn't be anyone's business, right? There are so many reasons, and you and I could go on all day. And some of them are about violence. You're fleeing from violence. You are in a violent situation. There's so many. It's not hard for me to imagine, given all the work I've done with women and children over the course of time, many, many scenarios in which you have a very legitimate reason, which is about personal safety, which is about your need to protect yourself, whatever it is. So that needs to be protected at all costs. But certain activities, child pornography, selling arms to terrorists, like selling weapons of war,
all the bad guy stuff.
Right? And like the bad guy stuff, we have to be honest about the fact that crypto is being used to fund some of that. Not the only means of using it. It's not even the main means of use of funding it, but it is being used to fund it. And what do we do about that? And the problem in our community, of course, is that once you identify a wallet, you can see the entire string of transactions from everything that wallet has done. And that's great if you're law enforcement and if it's truly a, quote, bad guy, because you're like, now I know every wallet that's engaged with them. But bad guys do legal things too, right? Like bad guys do bad things, and they also do neutral and fine things. So if the bad guy goes and buys a cup of coffee using a digital wallet, the coffee maker on the other side isn't necessarily a bad guy too, right? And so what is the standard around the investigation, the allowance that we're going to permit any law enforcement agency or government to engage in to make sure that they're tracking and targeting these bad actors that we do want to see stopped?
And and defining bad, right? Like, how do you define
bad?
Like, as an Arab American woman who gets stopped for every random security screening, I'm always like, I can always envision the Jason Bourne scenario in which I've used a DeFi protocol and I'm now on some red list. I'm now the bad guy. You know what I mean? And
that's right.
And I'm a good actor with good intentions. It's a real fear.
And we shouldn't minimize that fear. But we also have to acknowledge that some of those same protocols have been and are being used for things I think we would generally agree are antisocial.
That's right. There's a lot of frontier stuff. How, Sheila, do you fit it all in a day?
Yeah, that's such an ongoing, great question. I mean, look, when I first started here, I didn't have a team, and it was really crazy. It was kind of me doing all the things. Now I have an amazing team. I've hired an incredible group of people here. And the same thing at the forum. It was just me for a while, and then I hired an amazing team. I have I have amazing support from my parents, my in-laws, my husband at home, right? My school's teachers, all of that, right? So I think there's just it takes a village. It really takes a village. And I feel lucky that I grew up in an environment where I don't have any hesitation, like asking for that kind of help. Like, I'm like, it's normal to be like, I need this person to help with this thing or do this thing or whatever. That was just kind of normal. It's a lot. And I think crypto never sleeps, right? That's the benefit. It's also the curse. If you're working in this space, like it's never quiet. So there's always something going on. And we're in, again, this period of it's just acute right now. Like everything and all attention is kind of being focused on a lot of this stuff. So how do I do it all? I don't really know. I'm just going to be very honest. I don't think any of us who are parents and who have these big jobs, I don't think any of us really know. It's just about looking, ruthless prioritization. What needs to happen right now? What needs to happen? What's the most important thing that has to happen right now? What is the critical thing that has to happen, in today? And what am I looking at for the week? But also blocking out time for longer term planning to make sure we're always moving in a direction. We're always in motion in a direction that's productive and strategic. But it's also honestly taking times for conversations like this, like talking to friends, having the support system that we're lucky to have with our Women in Crypto and all of that, and reminding ourselves, why do we do this? Why do we run ourselves ragged? Why are we up at 2 a.m. checking what's going on in Europe? Why do we do it? It's because we care and we truly believe this is it's just so critically important. I believe I'm building a better world for my kids. I've got 3 daughters. I don't see the trajectory and the direction of travel for them as women in the world being great. And I want them to have opportunity to engage in transactions, to have their data be owned by them, to have that independence and liberty and freedom that I think is so critical and going to become more and more critical. And I don't want that to be threatened for them. That's really honestly like a big motivator for why I do what I do. But it comes down, I think, to just that passion and that belief that we're making a difference.
Sheila Warren, Harvard lawyer, crypto mom, innovation advocate, blockchain advisor. I am so lucky to know you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks, Sheila. It was a pleasure and an honor, Mona. Thank you for having me. Our time is up for now, but the conversation is still going. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at @SinoGlobalCap, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and leave us your feedback so we can loop it into upcoming episodes.